this is a little bit different than what I normally do because I've basically broken every rule of presentations here. There's a lot of text on these slides, and instead of telling you all something about what I learned, instead of telling you all something about what I've learned, this actually poses a series of questions. A series of questions that I've asked myself in the past scaling various businesses, and I think are a helpful framework to think about some of the questions that you all may be facing as you're thinking about the businesses that you run in terms of growth and scale. I think we've got about 20 minutes for this. I'll go through it fairly quickly, and then happy to take any questions that you all may have. I'll just give you a quick 30 seconds on who I am. I'm from San Francisco, my hometown, great place to be from. My parents are both engineers. My mom's a software developer, which is kind of the culture I grew up around. I thought that was kind of normal, and then I realized pretty quickly that it wasn't. Like a lot of people, you want to get away from what you grew up around, and even though I grew up in kind of the heart of Silicon Valley, that was no different for me, and so I left, studied finance, did some things in banking that I would describe as pretty soulless, if I'm honest with you. And I was in London and having a beer with a friend of mine, and he said, "Hey, you're crazy. You're from San Francisco. That's where the action is. What are you doing here?" And I said, "Yeah, you're probably right." So I moved back to San Francisco without a job, one-way ticket. I called a friend of mine who I'd worked for a summer when I was at university. I said, "Hey, I need a job." He said, "Okay, do you know what a product manager is?" I said, "No idea." He said, "Do you want to be one?" And so by just pure luck, I ended up somehow as a junior product manager at Intuit. And for those of you that are in product management or spend time around product, Intuit's actually quite a well-known product and product management company. So again, sheer luck. Ended up at sort of the education program of a very well-known product management company. Did that for 3 years, built a bunch of different products. Big products where you'd spend 6 months deciding should we make that button blue or green, and new products where we'd start from wireframes and build. Loved everything about it except it was slow. So in late 2011, early 2012, I made a list of what I thought were the 5 most interesting companies in San Francisco. And the company that was at the top of the list was really small, and it was basically building a taxi dispatch app. And I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. And so I remember telling my dad that I was going to go talk to this company. He said, "That is the dumbest idea I've ever heard." And that was Uber. I joined Uber in 2012. It was about 70 employees globally when I joined. This is not an offense to the Americans in the room. I am one. But you all have probably spent enough time around Americans to know that sometimes Americans have a narrow worldview. And I grew up in San Francisco. My parents were from India. And so I met some very nice Americans who had maybe a little bit of a narrow worldview. And they said to me, "Hey, why don't you be the international guy?" And I said, "Great." Not knowing that I was deeply unqualified for that. You'll sense a theme of the deeply unqualified throughout this talk. So I ended up at Uber in 2012. It was about 70 employees, was really the first person tasked with helping to evaluate Uber's international growth and expansion strategy when it was primarily a US company. My first 52 weeks at Uber, I traveled to 35 countries to figure out if Uber's model could scale. And then if it could, to make kind of a go, no-go decision about how to actually expand and operate businesses outside of the US and North America primarily. Did that for a few years, then got really tired of living on a plane, so ended up raising my hand and saying, I really want to run a P&L. Right? I thought that was an important thing to learn. And so former CEO of Uber, Travis, said to me, "Okay, I'm going to ask you to run the worst performing P&L we have to see kind of what you have." And so that was Uber's P&L in emerging markets. It was Eastern Europe, Russia, Middle East, and Africa. Super fortunate experience. Started in that business from sort of when it was very, very small, and took it to a really, really great position, learned a lot, built a wonderful team. And then the last 2 years I was at Uber, I worked on Uber Eats. And that was kind of from its inception to the first sort of 2.5 years of its growth. I left Uber about 8 months ago, feels like 8 years. And doing some of my own projects, a couple of non-exec roles, doing some of my own investing, and we'll have something to announce hopefully in the next few weeks, which I'll leave you with there. That's definitely not how that slide's supposed to look, but the blue and red dots are the key points. So this is kind of why I'm here, right? Is this chart was Uber's international growth and expansion strategy. The years are at the bottom, the cities are on the y-axis, blue is US, red is non-US, and you can see there's sort of a period of 2.5 years here where we're still figuring things out, and then early 2013, really, you see that spike. And so what I try to do today is try to frame the questions that both we asked ourselves, but also questions that I think are important to ask. There's one caveat I think is super important when you talk to folks who worked at companies like Uber and Airbnb, right? Which is that we were super fortunate. We had incredible product market fit. And I think it's probably a bit disingenuous to prescribe some of the tactics we used to every business in the world because it's just probably unrealistic. So I recognize that. I'm mindful of that. Some of the things I'm going to say, you may say that's completely irrelevant. Some of the things may be more relevant. People always ask me, like, what should I be thinking about the international expansion? The provocative title of this talk, it was Speed Invest guy's idea, not mine. The first rule of international expansion, what is it? It's actually a really simple rule. And I'm not being facetious, right? Like, the reason I think this way is actually really simple, which is about motivation, right? Why are you expanding? Why are you growing? Are you growing because you've got a problem? Are you expanding because you have not figured something out in a place you should have, and therefore you're trying to solve it in another place? Very rarely have I seen something that, seen a business where they haven't figured it out in country one, go to country two, and that mean they figure it out. Not always, there's some exceptions to that rule, but that motivation matters a lot. Or do you actually have something worth scaling? So you go back to this Uber chart, again, sorry for the green lines, those aren't supposed to be there. The red line at the bottom, that red horizontal line, is about a year. And that was a year where Uber was only in one city. It was actually only in one part of one city, trying to figure out, could build supply liquidity, build a product customers loved, build an acquisition model that made sense financially, and build a model that actually could achieve the thesis of the investment round of the company. That green line now, the green horizontal line, that's the first international sort of growth story at Uber, and that's almost a 2-year exercise. Again, this is in one of the fastest growing companies we've seen. So that exercise of proof point to actual growth takes quite a bit of time. And then you can see that sort of almost vertical white line in terms of once you've figured it out and you've got some capital and you've got some capacity, the importance of pace and what that means. And I know there's obviously a lot being talked about where Uber is, and I'm super happy to entertain those conversations after as well. But I think the steps in that process, I don't think change that much. So what are the questions that should be asking? And this is where it sort of goes into questions, not answers. So just be prepared for that. So the way I think about it is there's kind of 5 questions that I ask now when looking at a business or talking to a founder about expansion and growth. It's, have we got it right? Do we have a product that people love? Are they retaining? Are they coming back? Are they referring the product to their friends? And do we feel good about the fundamentals of who we are? Have we got it repeatable? So do we know what it takes to duplicate the business from country A to country B, or city A to city B, or vertical A to vertical B? Do we understand what is different? This is my favorite example. I got a specific example here. It's one of my favorite business story examples in the world. I'll tell you about it then. But it's just this idea of there's this weird kind of balance between negotiating what has worked for you in the past in scale with sort of the humility of where you're going. And that balance is a really important exercise. It's not a perfect answer. It varies a lot business to business, right? We're all in startups because we want to create something better, more improved, potentially disruptive. So you've got to do better than the status quo. But if you walk in sort of guns blazing, there's some consequences to that too. We have the team, often very overlooked, but I would argue probably the most important thing. I think we've all been part of teams or examples where individuals have willed mediocre or bad markets to success, and poor individuals have taken high potential markets and turned them into absolute screw-ups. And then maybe the most existential question, is it worth it? What are you actually trying to achieve with this exercise? I'll pause for photos. Good. All right, so this, I'm just going to run through these quickly, right? But these are the questions of kind of how I think about, have we got it right? Do customers love our product? Are they staying? Do we have a scalable acquisition model? Do we feel good about unit economics? These are some ways you can measure all of those things. Again, some of this to me is for sure about the quantitative measures. I think Bezos has a great line about NPS and some of these quantitative measures, which is I actually care a lot more about the qualitative answers behind the measure in a lot of these situations, particularly around things like this scalable acquisition model is interesting, right? Because I think when I talk to companies who feel this way, they immediately will tell me their CAC LTV ratios. They're like, that's great, but actually, if the only way you're going to be able to get there is with this massive capital infusion on paid marketing, do you really have it? What I really want to know is what percentage of customers are coming to you organically? What percentage of customers are coming to you from a referral program? On the retention side, it's not just about absolute retention for me, particularly in businesses like marketplaces. It's about the improvement of the cohorts over time. So as you build scale and theoretically improve your product experience, do you actually see improvement in that cohort performance and retention? And then I think that last one is one we're all learning about a lot, right? Which is just how far down the financial proof curve do you need to be? Because I think there was a previous world where it was just about take rates, right? And there was a world where it was just about gross margin. And there was a world where it was just about net inflow. And now we're starting to go even further down that curve, which I think is the right discipline. Have we got it repeatable? This is like, if you take away one thing from this exercise, it's this. The second country is always the hardest. It's about reorienting your entire company to a multi-country model. And a lot of people that I've seen have no separation between their core, let's call it business platform, and their home country, right? Their head of product is also their local product manager for Sweden, which is their home country. But when you add Norway or the Netherlands, who owns that? That exercise of figuring out second country models, you see it with a lot of US companies when they come to Europe, and like the first question I get is like, what is VAT? And but if you take it a step further, you realize like your entire financial architecture has to change. And the model doesn't exist in a lot of US payment processors, back-end infrastructure providers. A lot of money PMs in San Francisco have no idea what VAT is. We literally had a presentation at Uber which was, what is VAT? And we just share it with people. But that exercise is one I'd really ask yourselves, which is re-architecting your teams to support that is really important. Have we got it repeatable? Do we know what levers to pull? The most important part of this exercise for me is this idea of the playbook, right? Have you, in great detail, written down what it takes? Have you learned from your mistakes and your experiences? Have you turned those into actionable lessons? Have you built internal experts on particular topics to create mind share and knowledge share across your businesses? Do you know the cost implications of expansion, which are massive and greater than you think? You all know how hard it is to incorporate companies in certain countries. Imagine doing that in 14 countries. Do you know how to be more efficient now than you were back then? You should see improvement in performance. You should expect to raise the bar. So if it took you 18 months to achieve milestone X in country 1, set the bar so you can achieve it in 12 months in country 2. And hold teams accountable to that exercise. And then do you have a scalable acquisition model? That's just rinse and repeat. This is literally the exact same words from the previous slide, but that to me is, I think, when you look at practical mistakes where I think people go wrong. Do we understand what it is? This is my favorite. Okay. Sorry, wait, hang on. Carrefour, French retailer, apologies. Anybody works there, parents worked there, anything like that. Carrefour, French retailer, early 2000s, flying. One of the largest economies in the world at that time, still is Japan. They're like, we're going to go to Japan. They go to Japan, open 10 stores, hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, build supply chain infrastructure, all this product localization stuff, the right fruit, the right vegetables, the right textiles, the right sizes, the right store footprint. Carrefour launches in Japan, and it's like absolute disaster. And nobody can figure out why. And they finally hire a Japanese sort of cultural expert. That's a job. And that person goes to the Carrefour store in France, and they see the store. And then they go to the Carrefour store in Japan, and they see the store, and they go, oh, you guys are idiots. And they say, what do you mean? And they said, if you've been to a Carrefour, the people who check you out, they sit on a stool like this. It's like part of their efficiency scheme that they're sitting, not standing. But if you're in Japan, you're in a service culture, and you're sitting down, and the customer is standing up, that is like an affront to your family. And so basically, in like 3 days, everybody in Japan went to one of these Carrefour stores, obviously exaggerating. A lot of people went to these stores. They were like, oh, this is interesting. They went to check out, and they were like, this is terrible. You just offended me and my culture. I'm never going here again. Exits Japan. This is 2005. This is what the BBC website looked like. So there's a couple different variables in there, right? But the way I think about it, again, is in the lens of these questions, is this idea of like, what are your non-negotiables, right? Who are you as a company, and what is important to hold true in the new model or the new world in which you operate in, and where do you have to adapt? And this is also, I think, it ties really closely to this team point. So I think the companies I've seen that have been most successful in this exercise have had that balance. They've had what I call culture carriers, which are people from the home market or core team that come to the new country to help with that sort of seeding of culture and expectation. But they also augment that with really, really strong local talent. And that matters more in some countries than others. I'm happy to go into the details of that during the Q&A. But that sort of exercise is important. This is all reasonably self-explanatory. I won't go into too many more details there. The structure thing is interesting too, because I think is big, kind of one of the big takeaways I found in the context of internationalization is matrix organizations kill innovation, right? And that's sort of a well-known line from Hard Thing About Hard Things and others, but I think it's particularly true in the internationalization context. If you expand from an HQ office and you're trying to control that remotely, it becomes super difficult to actually evolve. Now, some of you may run businesses where you don't want them to evolve, and you want to drop the business into various countries, and that can work, right? Airbnb is a great example of a reasonably central organization that scaled dramatically over the world. It took them some time, but they did it really, really well. There are other companies that were much more distributed. Uber is a great example, much more distributed. There were benefits to that distribution in terms of speed and pace, but also downsides to that distribution, because you had a business that was different country to country, and you had to control the exercise of those country matters. I guess the last question is it worth it, right? What's the upside of expansion? What are you really trying to achieve? There are so many examples of businesses that can reach large TAMs and large addressable markets by just going deeper, adding products, adding geographies, adding revenue retention in their home markets. And then there's obviously the cash implications of this, right? I recognize how fortunate I was at working for a company that raised money at a really rapid clip, and that, of course, made things easier. I'm not naive about that, but the implications of the cost of capital and the expected return relative to going deeper in your home markets is an important kind of question. Build vertically or horizontally. A lot of people ask me about expansion models. I guess the way I think about it is 3 real questions to ask yourselves. One is, what's the role of technology in your expansion model? So how do you actually think about if you have a scalable tech platform and the importance of that? I'm a massive believer in much deeper technical investment, so that you have a platform that can scale. That obviously comes with a cost. But I've seen the companies that I've seen that have tried to piecemeal this with bodies in the long run are the ones that deal with massive negative consequences. Centralized versus not, this is really about team structure. Are you trying to run your international markets from your HQ, or are you prepared to distribute command and control to the actual countries? A lot of this comes down to how your business actually operates, the need for physical footprint, what your capital cost structures are. And then, is it capital intensive or not? The Netherlands is one of my favorite countries in this example, because a lot of Dutch companies, for a variety of reasons, that have been able to scale internationally, but over the real long haul, and they've effectively self-funded that expansion with profits from their home market. You're talking about 8, 10, 15 years horizons, with companies like MessageBird is a great example of this in the Netherlands, but really, really impressive way of reinvesting profit from their home market into the distributed markets. Real quick, if I summarize that into the Uber context, there's really kind of 4 points I'd stress. So one is, it's all about the playbook. right? It was deep investment in that playbook. So that I could hand you, new person, the playbook, and you would know how to operate the market in its earliest stages as well as I did. That framework around how to evaluate and prioritize markets was part of that exercise. Understand what's different, be humble in accepting that things are going to be different and understanding where to adapt. I would argue we could have even done that better. Build culture carriers, so these are people from your home markets that you can send to new markets to ensure that your team, office, vibe actually supports who you are. Really, really overlooked, maybe one of the most important things. Keep the hiring bar high, right? I think we've all been in this situation, desperate to get somebody in, desperate to get going. Should we do it? Should we not? Maybe we sort of justify a less than perfect hire because it's different. No chance. Networks are small. There's enough global companies where you know people who worked at places like, take your pick, Google, McKinsey, Goldman Sachs, whatever, have some bar that have international experience, and that could be a way to pressure test that. There were some things that didn't fit neatly into the slides, so I just wrote them down. Second country is always the hardest. We talked about that. Write the playbook. We talked about that. Capital requirements matter because you can't underestimate what this actually costs. It costs a lot of time and money. You're unlikely to find product market fit in country 2 if you have not found it in country 1. I've just not seen a lot of businesses where that happened. Again, some examples. Sustainable scale models. This is this MessageBird example. You don't have to expand in sort of a light the cash on fire way. You just don't. There are other ways to do that. A famous American football coach, and his quote is, the whole quote is, the team, the team, the team. That's the quote. And that resonates a lot with me in the context of this. As I've said, I've seen great teams will pour market opportunities to success and seen terrible teams take easy market opportunities and screw them up. Some good case studies I like. Stripe is a great case study on international expansion. I'm really impressed with how they've done it. Really, really amazing. Focused on sort of a core set of countries. Did that really, really well. No disrespect to anybody. Zynga and Ofo, maybe some examples of some less than ideal approaches. I really don't like startup books. I think most of them are pretty useless. The Elad Gil High Growth Handbook is one. When I read it and I went, I wish I'd read this 6 years ago at Uber, because it actually would have been really, really helpful. And that's me on Twitter, and my email is just that@gmail.com, so feel free to ping me if you need anything.